The wolf had not stopped moving since she climbed onto its back. Sable had not intended to climb onto its back. That was the part she kept returning to as the wind came off the outer wall and the cobblestones blurred beneath the wolf's enormous paws, and the court erupted into something between silence and screaming behind her. She had been crossing the eastern yard with the dispatch case under her arm, the same route she had taken every morning for 3 years, and the wolf had simply been there, enormous and grey-white and radiating a heat she could feel from 4 paces away. And then it had lowered its head to the level of her hip, and she had done the only thing that made any sense in that moment, which was to grab the scruff at its neck and swing herself up before it moved again. It moved again immediately. The dispatch case was still in her arms. She had the presence of mind to be grateful for that. The iron clasp, shaped like a wolf consuming its own tail, so old the detail had worn smooth on one side, pressed into her forearm through her coat sleeve, and she held it tighter and kept her knees in and told herself that she was a records courier for the court of King Calix Dre, and that she had a delivery to make, and that whatever was happening would resolve itself if she simply stayed calm and did not fall off. The wolf ran a full circuit of the inner yard. Then it stopped in the center of the courtyard, directly in front of the great hall's main doors, and sat. Sable looked up. The Alpha King was standing in the doorway. She had seen him at a distance before. Everyone had seen the Alpha King at a distance. He moved through the court like a change in the weather, tall enough that door frames were a consideration, the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller, and people feel the particular smallness of being in a room that did not belong to them. She had delivered documents to his outer antechamber 73 times in 3 years. She had never been inside the antechamber. She had stood in the corridor outside it, and passed the case to whichever aide happened to be near the door, and then she had walked back down the stone stairs to the records hall in the lower quarter, and that was the entirety of her relationship with the most powerful man in the known territories. He was looking at the wolf. Then, very slowly, he was looking at her. She became aware of the crowd that had gathered, courtiers pressing against the far wall of the yard, advisers frozen in the gallery overhead, 2 guards with their hands on hilts they had not drawn, because they did not know what drawing a weapon would accomplish here. She became aware that her hair had come partially loose from its binding, and that she was sitting astride the Alpha King's wolf in the middle of the eastern courtyard at 7 in the morning, with a dispatch case under her arm, and that there was no protocol for this situation in any document she had ever copied. She looked at the wolf beneath her, then back at the king. "I have a delivery for the outer chancery," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. The Alpha King looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softened, not warmed, simply changed quality, the way light changes quality when a cloud moves. Then he looked at the wolf again. The wolf had not moved. It was still sitting. Its tail, she felt this more than saw it, swept once across the cobblestones. "Come inside," the king said. It was not an invitation phrased as a question. It wasn't cruel either. It was simply the kind of sentence that reorganized the world around itself. She climbed down from the wolf. Her boots hit the stones, and she straightened her coat and walked up the steps past him into the great hall, still holding the dispatch case, because she had a delivery to make, and she intended to make it. Her name, in the court's records, was listed as Sable Voss, and she crossed out the last name mentally, even as she thought it, because Voss was a name from a dissolved house that had not existed for 11 years and carried no more weight than the paper it was written on. She was Sable. She kept records and ran dispatches for the lower chancery. She slept in a narrow room in the service wing that had a window the size of a prayer book and a view of the kitchen yard. She ate at the second sitting, after the staff of the inner quarters, before the stable workers. She wore grey. She owned 3 coats and kept them in good repair. She was, in the court's vocabulary, invisible. not cruelly invisible, not tormented or abused or deliberately overlooked, simply uncategorized. There was no slot in the hierarchy for what she was, which was a records keeper of unusual accuracy and speed, from a bloodline the court had decided to forget about, and so the hierarchy had done the sensible thing and declined to put her anywhere in particular. She had made her peace with this years ago. Invisibility had its uses. She could walk through most of the palace without being stopped. She knew the routes through the lower corridors well enough to navigate them in the dark. She knew which doors were left unlocked and which scribes in the upper offices would accept a delivery directly and which required she leave it with the third aide and wait for a signature. She knew the contents of a great many documents that had passed through her hands, not because she read them improperly, but because she was fast and careful, and her eyes moved over words without her having to try very hard. She also knew that the dispatch case under her arm had been flagged twice in the past 10 days. First at the outer gate, where the sentry had held it longer than usual before letting it through, and again in the routing office, where Administrator Corveth had picked it up and turned it over in her hands before setting it back down and saying nothing at all. Administrator Corveth said nothing at all about very few things. She was publicly respectable, admired for her precision, and had spent 15 years building a particular architecture of procedure around herself that made her, for practical purposes, untouchable. She was not cruel to Sable directly. She was not cruel to anyone directly. She simply used the court's own rules like tools, and she was very good at it, and she had been looking at the dispatch case for 10 days, in the particular way she looked at things she intended to do something about. Sable had been watching this from the distance that invisibility affords. She had not told anyone. She had continued her routes, continued her deliveries, continued to carry the case without opening it. She had a job to do. She intended to do it. What she had not accounted for was the wolf. The Alpha King's name was Calix Dre. He was 6 feet and 4 inches of something that had long since stopped being merely a person and had become instead a kind of institutional force. Still a man, still someone who slept and ate and consulted with advisors, but also something that the court had built itself around for so long that it was difficult to say where one ended and the other began. He was not unkind. That was the thing people who encountered him from the outside did not understand. They expected cruelty from that much authority and were surprised by its absence. He was not kind either, in the warm, particular way of someone who had time for it. He was simply operating at a scale where individuals did not often register unless they required something from him. His wolf was known. The size of it, no wolf in the living memory of anyone in court approached it. Grey-white, pale as old ash, built like something out of the oldest stories. It had not allowed a rider in living memory. It had not allowed approach for anything other than formal necessity. It had, on 3 recorded occasions in the past decade, stood between the king and individuals who meant him harm, and those individuals were no longer living. The guards knew it. The courtiers knew it. Everyone knew it. What no one had known until 40 minutes ago was that it would lower its head for a records courier from the lower chancery and then carry her at a full run around the inner yard, while the entire assembled court looked on and forgot what they were supposed to be doing. Calix sat across from her now in a small chamber off the great hall, a room that was not a throne room, not a council chamber, just a room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that let in the grey morning light. He had dismissed everyone. The wolf was outside the door. She could hear it breathing through the thick wood. He looked at the dispatch case, then at her. "Your name," he said. "Sable." She set the case on the table between them. "I work in the lower chancery, records and dispatch. I was on my way to the outer chancery with that when your—" She paused. "When I was redirected." A beat. His expression did not change. "You were redirected." "I was redirected," she agreed. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of dry humor, suppressed before it arrived. He looked at the case. The iron clasp, wolf eating its own tail, caught the light. "What's in it?" "I don't know." She met his eyes without looking away. They were dark and held a quality of attention that she recognized as a kind of surveillance, the look of a man cataloguing everything in the room and giving nothing back. "My job is to carry it, not to open it." "Whose seal is that?" She looked at the clasp. "I was told it came from the Northern District offices. The original case, I mean. The routing slip said it was a transfer of land records from the Veth territory dissolution." He was quiet for long enough that she had time to notice the particular quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but of someone thinking so precisely that the rest of them was being very economical about existing. "How long have you been in the lower chancery?" he said. 3 years. Before that. I came from the eastern border territories. My house was dissolved when I was 17. She said it without inflection. The fact of it had had years to lose its edges. He looked at her, not at the case, at her, for the first time with something other than administrative evaluation. She did not know what the other thing was. She kept her hands still on the table. "My wolf," he said, "has not carried a rider since the reign of Queen Asthara Niven. That was 270 years ago." She absorbed this. "I wasn't aware of that history." "Neither was I, until approximately 20 minutes ago, when my archivist came to find me in considerable distress." He stood. He moved to the window and looked out at the yard where the wolf was now visible from above, a white shape on grey stone. "Archivist Pellan is 83 years old. He has been in this court for 60 years. He cried." She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing. "He says it means something specific." Calix did not turn from the window. "About you." "What does it mean?" Now he turned. He looked at her in a way that was still not warm and not unkind, still the quality of a man managing a situation at scale, but with something underneath it that she could not categorize, something that was not quite under control. "That," he said, "is what I am going to find out." Archivist Pellan was small, very old, and had the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for something for a very long time and was now operating at a speed his body had not anticipated. He was waiting in the outer antechamber with a leather volume under each arm and the expression of a man who had decided that hierarchy was someone else's problem today. He looked at Sable. His eyes went immediately to the dispatch case still under her arm, then to her face. Then he said, without preamble, "Your wrists." She looked at her wrists. Ink, as always, the fine-grained residue of a morning's copying that no amount of washing entirely removed. The right wrist worse than the left. "That's from work," she said. "I know what it's from. I've been a scribe for 60 years. He opened one of the volumes. "What is your mother's bloodline name?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And her mother's?" She told him that too. Pellan looked at the king. Then he laid the volume open on the table between them and pointed to a passage that she could not quite read from her angle. Old court script, the compressed formal hand used for historical record, faded to brown. 270 years ago, Pellan said, and his voice had steadied into the register of someone reading aloud from an important document. The wolf of King Asta Dre chose the last rider it would permit. Her name was Queen Asthara Niven. She was, prior to the wolf's choosing, a records archivist from a minor dissolved house in the eastern border territories. He paused. He looked at Sable. She carried the court's dispatch case on the morning the wolf chose her. It was documented. The case had an iron clasp, the same clasp, it appears, that you are carrying now. The room was very quiet. "The same case?" Calix said. "The same design. Whether it is the literal same physical object." Pellan closed the book. "The records do not say how the case was passed down, only that it was." Sable looked at the clasp. Wolf eating its own tail. She had carried it for 3 years. She had never thought about where it came from. The routing office had simply given it to her on her first week as the standard lower chancery dispatch case, and she had used it every day since. She looked up at the archivist. What happened to Queen Asthara? She became one of the 3 queens the court still records by name. He gathered his volumes. She brought evidence to the council that had been withheld from the king for 11 years, evidence about the dissolution of the eastern border houses. He looked directly at Sable, including your mother's house. The cold in the room felt different suddenly. Not the cold of stone corridors and mourning, the cold of something clicking into place that had been moving toward this position for a very long time. The dispatch case, Calix said. He said it quietly. The case from the Northern District offices. The Veth territory dissolution, Sable said, equally quietly. The land records from the eastern border territories. They looked at each other. She thought about the way Administrator Corveth had turned the case over in her hands, the particular quality of Corveth's stillness, the way Corveth said nothing about things she intended to act on. I think, Sable said, we should open it. She was right about the contents. She had suspected she was right. In the careful, methodical way she suspected things. Not dramatically, not with her hands shaking, but with the steady accumulation of small observations that had been building for 10 days. 11 years, if she was being precise about when it started. The case held land records, as the routing slip promised. But the land records were a single thin layer over something else entirely. A set of documents in Administrator Corveth's own hand that detailed a proceeding from 11 years ago, the same year Sable was 17, the same year the eastern border houses had been dissolved. The documents described a council motion, properly filed, formally submitted, all correct procedure. They described the grounds for the dissolution, debts owed to the Crown, evidence of disloyalty, a recommendation from the court's administrative office. The recommendation was signed by Corveth. The evidence of disloyalty was not attached. There was a notation where it should have been, a reference number, a filing date, but no document. The evidence that had dissolved 7 houses and displaced hundreds of people, including a 17-year-old girl who now slept in a service wing room with a window the size of a prayer book, did not exist, had never been filed. The reference number led, if you traced it through the court's filing system, which Sable knew as well as she knew anything, which was to say very well, to a blank space in the records that had been neatly maintained as a blank space for 11 years. She spread the documents on the table in the small chamber. She did not explain them all at once. She laid them in order, oldest to newest, and she walked the king and the archivist through them, without raising her voice, without performance, using the careful, precise diction of someone who had been trained to let records speak for themselves. Calix did not interrupt. He watched her move through the documents with the expression of a man who was filing and categorizing at considerable speed, and beneath that, the expression of a man encountering something he had not known was there and was recalibrating around. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. She filed a false dissolution, Calix said. She filed a dissolution with a reference to evidence that was never attached. Whether she fabricated it or simply referenced something she intended to attach and never did. Sable set the last document back in the case. The result is the same. How long have you known? I suspected something was wrong with the routing slip 10 days ago. I didn't know what was in the case. She looked at him steadily. I knew the case was being watched. He was quiet. He looked at her. The long, considering look she had begun to recognize, the one where he was managing an enormous amount of information and letting very little of it onto his face. Why did you keep carrying it? Because it was my job. She closed the case. And because whatever was in it was going to end up in front of someone eventually. I thought it should end up in front of the right person. He looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable. Then, you walked into the eastern yard this morning intending to deliver that case to the outer chancery. Yes. If the wolf hadn't been there, I'd have left it with the third aide, waited for a signature, and gone back to the records hall. She paused. And then Administrator Corveth would have had it within the hour, and I expect that would have been the end of it. He said nothing. He was looking at the dispatch case with the particular expression of a man reviewing a sequence of events and determining at exactly which point the outcome had been decided. She knew the feeling. She had been doing the same calculation for 10 days. "Pellin," he said, without looking away from her, "get the counsel." Administrator Corveth was, as Pellin had described and Sable had observed, very good at her position. Her reaction to being called before the full council on an unscheduled morning was not alarm. It was a kind of controlled precision, the way a very good instrument responds when struck. She walked in, took her seat, folded her hands, and waited. She was good until the dispatch case appeared on the council table. Something happened to the quality of her stillness then, not a movement, nothing that could be described as visible panic. But Sable, seated at the end of the table where the king had placed her, watched the specific way Corveth did not look at the case, and knew that the calculation had already been completed behind those composed eyes. Corveth knew exactly what the case contained. She was determining how to proceed. The proceeding was formal. Calix ran it without raising his voice. The documents were read into the record by Pellin, who had abandoned all pretense of deference, and read with the particular vindication of an 83-year-old man who had been waiting for history to correct itself. The council listened. Corveth was offered the opportunity to respond. She responded with procedure. She cited the filing date, the motion number, the council vote, all technically correct, all real. She did not address the missing evidence. She filed a procedural objection to the admissibility of documents not obtained through the standard routing office. Sable reached into her coat and set 3 documents on the table. She had said nothing until this moment. She had sat at the end of the table and let the proceeding move through its formal stages, because she understood that formal stages existed for a reason, and that disrupting them served no one. But the procedural objection was the moment she had been waiting for. "These are receipts," she said, "from the routing office, showing the chain of custody for the case." She set the first one down. "This one is from 11 years ago, when the case was first registered. This one is from 3 years ago, when I was assigned it." She set the second. "And this one is from 10 days ago, when it passed through the routing office on its way to me. Administrator Corveth's initials are on the last one. That's her standard intake mark. She handled the case." Corveth looked at the document. Then she looked at Sable. It was the first time, in 3 years of passing within feet of each other in corridors and offices, that Administrator Corveth had looked directly at Sable. "I handle a great many cases," Corveth said. "You do," Sable agreed. "I've counted. In a typical week, you initial between 40 and 60. But this one you held for several minutes before returning it to the stack. I was in the outer office. I watched you do it." She set the third receipt on the table. "And I wrote it down." The council chamber was very quiet. Corveth looked at the receipt. Sable's own handwriting, the date, the precise notation of what she had observed, the time, the duration of the hold, and Sable watched the architecture that Corveth had been building for 15 years register very precisely that it had developed a crack it could not procedurally contain. "The evidence referenced in the dissolution motion," the council chair said. "Administrator Corveth, the attachment. Where is it?" Corveth was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own answer. "It is possible," she said finally, "that the filing was incomplete." The council chair looked at the king. Calix had not spoken since he began the proceeding. He had sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood and let it move through its stages. Now he looked at Corvette with the expression of a man who was about to do something proportional and permanent. "Strike the dissolution motion," he said. "All 7 houses. Restore the land records to their prior state." He paused. "And convene a full review of Administrator Corvette's filings for the past 15 years. Corvette's composure did not break. She was too well built for that, but something moved in her eyes, and what it was, Sable thought, was fear. Not defiance, not calculation, just fear, the plain and honest kind, arriving at last after a very long time of not being necessary. "The review will take months," Corvette said. "Yes," the king agreed. "It will." Sable walked out of the council chamber into the stone corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, because she needed 10 seconds of not being observed before she did anything else. The wolf was there when she opened her eyes. It had come from somewhere, from the courtyard, from wherever it had been waiting. And now it was simply present, filling the corridor with its size and its heat, regarding her with pale eyes that held an expression she had no category for. Not the neutral blankness of an animal, something more deliberate than that. She looked at it for a long moment. "I still have a delivery to make," she told it. The wolf's tail swept once. "The case goes to the outer chancery." She patted its enormous head, which she was surprised to find she could now do without thinking about it. "And then I have copying to finish before the second sitting." The wolf walked beside her through the corridor. She stopped trying to make it go back. Calix found her in the records hall 3 hours later. She was at her copying table, the one in the back left corner with the good light, the one she had occupied for 3 years because no one else wanted the corner, and she had learned that unclaimed corners were the best property in any room. The wolf had, at some point in the preceding hour, decided that the stone floor of the records hall was an appropriate resting place, and had arranged itself across the doorway in a manner that suggested permanence. The other scribes had relocated to a different room. Calix looked at the wolf, then at her. "You should eat," he said. She looked up from the ledger. "I eat at the second sitting." That was 3 hours ago. She had, in fact, missed the second sitting. She had not noticed. "I'll eat at the third," she said. He pulled the other chair, the one no one ever used, because it had a slightly uneven leg and sat at an angle, and sat in it without apparently noticing the angle. He put his elbows on the table in a way that suggested he had not spent much time at a copying table and was discovering it was lower than expected. He looked at the ledger she was copying. "The land records," he said, "from the Keth Northern District. They came in yesterday. They need to be copied before the end of the week or the filing falls behind." She kept writing. "It's straightforward." He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the table. "The dissolution of your house," he said. "I signed the motion 11 years ago. I was 22, and I signed what was put in front of me, and I did not check whether the evidence was attached." He looked up and met her eyes. "I should have checked." She held the pen still. There were a great many things she could have said to that. She had been 17 years old, and she had been moved from the only home she knew with 2 days' notice, and 30 years of her family's history had been dismissed with a reference number that led nowhere, and she had spent 11 years building a careful, invisible life in a court that had decided not to see her. There was an architecture of things she could have said. She thought about what the engine of all that was. A young king who signed what was put in front of him. A woman who spent 15 years building procedural walls around a blank space in the records. The very mundane machinery of how things go wrong. "You were 22, she said, "and it will be fixed." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to catalogue, the one where something was moving toward the surface, that his general management of scale usually kept well below it. "You're not angry?" he said. "I am," she said, "but not at you specifically." She looked back at the ledger, more at the general structure of things. A silence. Then, from him, the thing she had not expected. A very quiet exhale that was the sound of someone setting something down they had been carrying since she said the word fixed. "Pellin would like to conduct a full interview with you," he said, "about the bloodline records, about what you carry." He paused. He used the phrase historically significant 4 times in the space of 2 minutes. "I gathered," she said, "from the crying." Calix looked at her, and this time the thing under his expression made it all the way to the surface. Just briefly, just the dry flicker of it. "He cried again this afternoon when the wolf came back inside." She bit her lip to keep from smiling. Didn't entirely succeed. He noticed. Something in his face changed quality again. That particular shift in the light. "Stay," he said. It wasn't an offer phrased as a question, but it wasn't a command either. It was something that cost him slightly more than either. She looked at him. "Not because the wolf chose you," he said. "I understand if that's not sufficient reason. I am asking you separately, because I would like you to stay." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the records hall's single high window, the court was continuing. Footsteps, voices, the particular ambient sound of a great deal of institutional life moving through its usual channels, slightly reorganized. "I have copying to finish," she said. He waited. "After the copying," she said. "I'll give you an answer after the copying." He stood, straightened his coat, and left without pushing the chair back, because he had not noticed the angle. She watched him go. The wolf opened one eye from its position in the doorway, then closed it again. She went back to the ledger. Her answer, which she did not tell him until that evening, when he came to find her in the east corridor, with an expression of studied neutrality that was not hiding anything particularly well, was yes. 7 months later, the records hall in the lower quarter had been moved. Not because it was unfit. It wasn't. It was a perfectly functional records hall. But because the lower quarter's standard stone floors had been found, upon examination, to be insufficient support for the long-term occupancy of an extremely large wolf. The new records hall had oak flooring and a wider doorway and a window that was considerably larger than a prayer book. Sable sat at the same back left corner table with the good light. The dispatch case, its clasp worn smooth on one side, wolf eating its own tail, sat on the shelf above the table. Closed now, but not locked. It had been open more than closed in the past 7 months, which she had not expected and found she did not mind. The archivist Pellin appeared twice a week, uninvited, with volumes under each arm and questions about bloodline records and the particular morning 270 years ago, when a woman with ink on her wrists had climbed onto a wolf's back in the eastern yard. He and Sable had developed a working relationship that involved a great deal of precise argument about the interpretation of historical records and a great deal of very good tea, both of which she found equally satisfying. The wolf was asleep across the doorway. It had been asleep across the doorway since breakfast. It would be asleep across the doorway until it decided, for its own reasons, that it was not. This was simply a fact of the room now, like the good light and the oak floors and the width of the door. Calix came in at mid-morning, which he had taken to doing with a frequency that the rest of the court had adapted to without remark, because the rest of the court had learned that certain things were no longer negotiable. He sat in the other chair. Someone had replaced it at some point, with a chair that had an even leg, and she had not asked who, and set 2 documents on the table. "The Northern Road assessment," he said. The surveyor's report came back. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had opinions he was about to make available. "The Eastern Fork has been deteriorating for 4 years. The council flagged it twice. Nothing was done." She looked at the report. The Eastern Fork serves the border territories. It does. She looked at him. He was looking at the report. There was something in the set of his shoulders that she had learned to read, the specific quality of tension that meant he was holding something that was not entirely about road surveys. "Calix," she said. He looked up. "It's going to take time," she said. "The Eastern Border Territories, the restoration, the land records, the house records, the families that need to be found and notified." She held his eyes. "It's going to take years." "I know," he said. "I'm going to want to be part of it." "I know that too." He looked at her with the particular directness he had developed over 7 months of encountering someone who did not look away. "I was going to ask you about the filing system for the restoration records. Pellin says the current system is insufficient for the volume." "Pellin is right. I've been thinking about it." She turned to a fresh page in the ledger. "I have some ideas." He pulled his chair slightly closer. Not dramatically, simply close enough to look at the same page. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened, genuinely, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, the cataloguing precision that had once felt like surveillance and now felt like the specific shape of how he loved something, which was to pay it very close attention and then act on what he found there. The wolf shifted in the doorway. The morning light moved across the oak floor. The case sat on the shelf above her, open, the clasp catching the light. She had carried it for 3 years, without knowing what it contained or what it meant. She had carried it for 7 months, knowing exactly both, and the weight of it was different now, not lighter, not heavier, simply settled into its right shape. The iron wolf on the clasp still ate its own tail, endlessly, the way things do when they have been doing something for 270 years. She didn't think about it most mornings. It was simply there, the way the wolf was simply there, the way the good light was simply there. Ordinary, the impossible kind of ordinary, that only looks like that because you did not watch it being made. She still had ink on her wrists. She ate when she was hungry. The window was large enough to let in the cold, and she kept a coat on the back of her chair for when it did. She was, in the court's current vocabulary, no longer invisible. She was also, most mornings, still just trying to finish the copying before the second sitting. Some things do not change. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred it that way. If you could carry something for 3 years without knowing what it was, trusting only that it belonged in front of the right person, would you have kept walking? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.